The question is there a direction for transcendence in this work, as I heard it? And I don't know whether you mean whether there's a practical strategy of trying to transcend. Charlotte was a regular meditator who was involved in a community where there was a very intensive meditation practice every day. So it wasn't like she needed to use her painting activity as meditation. On the other hand, her painting activity was certainly a constant practice. I think every day she did paint, and she painted in a very informal way much of the time, sitting on sofas or in chairs or in bed. Charlotte had health issues at the end of her life and was not terribly energetic always. So a lot of the painting was done in a kind of relaxed kind of setting, as opposed to rigorously standing in front of a canvas or a piece of paper, or trying to be in a formal meditation procedure. On the other hand, I think that Charlotte's activity in making this work was very guided. As I've several times mentioned regarding her work, there were sometimes moments when she wasn't sure what to do next in a painting, when some parts of the painting would be fully developed and something else was needed or some change was required, and I would, as her partner, often volunteer some kind of a suggestion, like say, why don't you paint that blue, or put a circle here, or a curvy line, or a border around the whole thing. And over a period of more than 20 years, when Charlotte was making this work, I was fascinated that she never once, on any occasion, incorporated any of my suggestions. And this was not competitive or any kind of an attempt to somehow willfully follow her own inspiration. It was rather that she was guided in this work, that there were some things that she had to do in every painting. And this necessity of doing things in each painting came very specifically, I think, from some inner kind of impulses.
So I think that's something that what you just said, this idea, a lot of the artwork that I look for my current position at the hospital is pieces that can engage people for long periods of time. And I think that a lot of these pieces, as you mentioned, have this grid, and usually the grid is a fairly rigid structure. Some people handle it very well, and these are very interesting because of that idea of coming into being. These pieces sort of, what I like about a lot of these pieces is they sort of feel almost incomplete, almost always coming into being, almost trying to be sort of like a well. It just kind of keeps coming and sort of keeps coming. And the longer you look at the piece, you start to notice some of the subtleties.
I love that word well. That's and you might omit the word trying. I mean that well font.
But I think that's an important part, that trying to come into being, because I think it's a continuous process. Mm-hmm. And that it's sort of in that artwork, or the pieces that really speak to me. And so and I think that's an important aspect of a lot of this work, because you can spend a lot of time in front of it, and you can come back and visit it again, and you're going to find something else. And so I find that to be an attractive aspect of this work.
You don't have to think about it.
Right.
That was her right there. And what was it that this said up here? Somebody know? Can you repeat that? Phil?
There is nothing more to become. This is home.
And then there was something that Michael said about looking, and this is what you're looking at is what you're looking at, or something.
What you're looking for is what is looking.
Yeah, to me that really strikes me. It's about this being completely involved, completely absorbed in what she's doing, which is the way she worked, and so there's this she's recording the activation of the space in between making a mark and what is going on here on the page, but between there and her heart and mind. So the activation of that, the awareness that she had at that moment to reflect on that and then name the pieces in that way is significant to me anyway. That because she didn't think about highfalutin so much, I don't think, like Michael was saying, that this would be something highfalutin. But these things are made one step. It's just one step in front of another, taking a step and another step and another step. And those steps were just imbibed with the charge of her spirit. And it was always very simple, like what Ralph was saying. She didn't want to think. She would argue about that. I don't think about these things. I just make them.
Has everyone seen, maybe no one has seen, the talk that Charlotte gave when we had her last show here 2 years ago? That was a very historic and beautiful moment, for me anyway, where she talks about line. It's just, she was all there being herself and saying her thing that night. And is that on YouTube?
I don't know.
That's the one. Oh, it was done for the Media Center by.
Yeah, I just saw it yesterday.
Is it on YouTube?
The Fairfield Media Center channel.
What's that?
I saw it on YouTube.
Yeah, the Fairfield Media Center channel has a beautiful.
If you go to the Fairfield Media Center,
yes.
Because everyone should see that actually.
Yes.
I agree.
Okay.
What were you commenting on?
Oh, don't forget.
No, I have not forgotten.
Asking.
So I wanted to ask about, just because I had gotten to know Charlotte kind of later in her life, and I wanted to know about sort of the earlier, and how the earlier Charlotte and how she came to be interested in consciousness. And I know it was the 60s, but I think everyone sort of has their own introduction, and you kind of flirt with your interest before you make your commitments.
There was definitely a period of psychedelics and then meditation. And meditation for Charlotte was totally what she wanted to do once she began practicing it. Her daily involvement with just closing her eyes and letting things flow was a critical part of her life. But I don't think it was an intellectual or conceptual process. Nor was it exactly an emotional one. It was more, it was just sort of the flow of her life force was in that. And I think her painting practice was, I think she learned a lot from Banu. He was the artist whose picture I showed you in the book, this very famous miniaturist. He was a great devotee of Krishna. And as she described it, she sat in his studio for a month with him, and he would be sitting painting, and there was a great involvement with making lines with a squirrel hair brush. They talked about how the Indian squirrel, they catch chipmunks in little traps, and they clip the end of the chipmunk's tail and let the chipmunk go, and they're very happy there's no animals being killed and whatnot, and they're making these little brushes. And then they have these little brushes that they hold in their hand. And Banu talked about how there's this flow from the heart through the arm into the hand to the tip of the brush onto the page. And the idea was that in doing this, one could experience a kind of act of devotion, almost like a religious ritual or something. For Banu, it was an ecstatic process, at least that's the way it looked to Charlotte. He would be sitting there painting. He was a great devotee of the Indian god Krishna, and he would be painting Krishna, and he would make a couple of very wonderful strokes with his brush, and then he would say, ah, sort of sigh. His eyes would close, and he would just sit there in a brief rapture. And then his eyes would open, and he would again make another stroke, like that. And I think she even mentions that in the talk.
She does, I think.
Yeah, it was
in the artist statement, she talks about he felt he taught meditative brushwork.
Yeah. So that was a huge part of this, and that came very late. That was in 1996. It's interesting to look back at the early little psychedelic, symbolic abstractions in the entryway. Well, gosh, a lot of the stuff is already there. The use of lines, even if they're made out of beads, and the circles and the squares, and a lot of the things you see here are there. But I think a lot of the power of the mature later work comes from this idea that there is, in skillful means, in this articulation. Banu told her that if she worked at making lines for many, many years, it would become very natural, and she would have total mastery. And she said, how many years? He said, well, at least 20. And she said, oh, I'll be very old in 20 years. And he said, at least you will have it before you die. So there was this idea, and she really did achieve. These are a lot of her brushwork is certainly not on the level of Banu's, but there's a lot of effortless flow, and I do think that she took a deep breath after each stroke and kind of went back inside and connected with consciousness. I think that, to answer your question just a little more, in the 60s, when Charlotte was painting those little abstractions, we had seen Ait Mukherjee's book, Tantra Art, which had just been published, and it was revelatory for both of us. We were just, this is the kind of art we want to make. We want to make work which has some abstract, symbolic power to evoke a flow of awareness. So I think the aspiration was there, but I'm not sure that Charlotte, she had the means in her immediate. She immediately went after the grid. That was like when she made the big knitted hangings. It was just, those works emerged full born. Like I think some gods came out of Zeus's head. They were. It was just. She didn't go through a process of figuring out how to compose her knitted hangings. It was just right there. And I imagine that involvement with that part of the grid came from her interest in Tantra, in a way. It's hard to be specific because she also loved American quilts and Native American blankets, and she wasn't naive about art traditions, so it wasn't like there was unfamiliarity with the way in which mystical realities can be invested into geometry. She always loved geometry, even from her high school days. It was like, this is the part of math that I can relate to, and this is sort of how the world is. But she wasn't at all mathematically sophisticated, or it was all just intuitive, automatic connection rather than learning or anything. But I think this thing that came from Banu, where she suddenly had a gesture that could capture and embody, or could I shouldn't say capture, but could express and then embody this mood of delight and devotion and connection was something that emerged very very clearly through this process, that she then just didn't want to live without practicing at any point. She was just always painting.
Thank you.
In some of what you just said, and when you started speaking, I was thinking of an aspect of dailiness, and which sometimes implies to me the opposite of rising to the occasion. Is that any part of what you're speaking about, or of what she did?
Well, unlike you, she didn't have a daily painting practice. I know some of your paintings are labeled daily painting, which I always loved that. Charlotte did paint every day, but she wasn't trying to finish work in any given time period. The work told her when it was finished, and I think she spent the better part of a month on almost every painting she did, but she worked on many at once. But it was just the sitting and holding the brush and doing that work on a completely regular basis that I think unfolded that process.
I have a question. I noticed that I was wondering where a lot of this paper was coming from and what her relationship with the paper perhaps was. I noticed that a lot of the paper has, as someone who's really involved with languages and thinking a lot about different ways that languages appear, like visual languages, but also other kinds of languages. I was wondering if she connected at all with the language that was on the paper initially, and what she felt about the process of perhaps, I don't know, what was the engagement with the language that was on the paper?
I think that she didn't know what the language was specifically. Some of this is Parsi, or and some Hindi and some Sanskrit, and the papers are all antique Indian papers that she purchased primarily in Jaipur. Some she got in the Himalayas, and these were like sometimes accountants' ledger pages and sometimes sacred text. Sometimes they were books that were cut up or that fell apart, and the paper was then kind of recycled by making it available. Miniature painters in India always paint on antique paper, and they often incorporate some found elements. They have the perfect ability to paint over with opaque white or other deep colors any artifacts that are on the paper they start with, but they sometimes at least leave it. And for Charlotte, after her involvement with found fabric, appropriating patterns from fabric that she bought in stores, it was just like, this is a graphic element that I want. The paintings also tend to exist, I think, in flat planes. The paper is a flat plane that is parallel to the viewer's eyes, and the writing is always sort of flat on a page, or at least usually, and so that was like a plane, and then there would be another maybe layer and another layer. There would be the layer of the borders, and there would be the layer of various images, and sometimes in certain of the works there are little embellishments as well, almost like little in music. Sometimes there are ornaments, and Charlotte would add sometimes almost gratuitously little flowers or some little. She would just make some little playful mark, which seemed in some ways to have nothing to do with the overall scheme, but was just yet another layer of information. often these playful marks related to flowers and plants. She had a way of making vines and then leaves, and that was a recurrent motif. A lot of the paintings that are behind you over there have, feature that, consist almost entirely of arrangements of leaves around geometric forms. And she used all of this, I think, in part to express her very rich involvement with plants. She would often go for walks, particularly at the end of her life, but this was going on all the time. And she felt that plants spoke to her. She could respond to the devas in the plants, the spirits, the life energy in the plants in a way that was very real. And then I think the fact that she had a kind of language, visual language, a kind of brushstroke, and a way of always sort of referencing and recreating those leafy ornaments. And so often if you look at some of these paintings, you'll see she has a rigorous grid or something of that sort. And then you look and, oh my goodness, there's some little leaves somewhere near the edge, sometimes in an almost random position, and other times they're deeply embedded. Sometimes they're even, a painting will be all red, and she will have maybe left a place where the leaves could show through from a prior layer. She's painted the red around leaves. So it was a very purposeful inclusion. It wasn't like just some casual little imposition on top. But nonetheless, conceptually, it seems like just the fullness of life was one of the great themes, and that it exists in the plant world as well as those are some things. And I mean, she loved calligraphy. She loved writing as visual form. And so whenever she had a piece of paper that had something nice on it, or something that turned her on, that was attractive, she honored it and enlivened it. Sometimes even, I think, like if you look at this one, where there's a lot of writing, it looks to me like she put some glows underneath some of the writing. I could grab this one and pass it around, and you'll see that she's kind of, she's mainly popping up this geometric form, but there's also some places here where she's popped the writing up a little bit with white auras. And I think that's an example of how very involved she was. Maharishi used to talk a lot about Ritambara Pragyan, which is a level of consciousness, or I guess it's more an aspect of consciousness in which the truth is known and seen and fully experienced inside awareness without reference to the external world, so that one can go back to an experience that one has had, or have an experience that one has never had with as if complete sensory richness. There could be smells, there could be sounds, there could be visions. All of this would just be imparted possibly by some stimulus, like a symbol that would trigger, or some inner manifestation of an idea, something of that kind. And that whatever comes at this level is true, is real, and is in harmony with the structure of subtle creation and the manifest universe as well. And there's a notion that if one has this kind of envisioning power, if one is in touch with Ritambara Pragyan, is in touch with truth, can then make things that are in some way almost perfect. Agnes Martin talked about this in terms of the idea that we can never actually make anything that's perfect, but that in the viewer there's such an appetite for perfection that we leap across the gap. We rush in to fill whatever inadequacies exist in the material form. And the surprise for me, I think, in re-encountering Charlotte's work in the way I have, is that there is something of this level of truth or of inner life, which is not just vital, but also somehow very universal, like a kind of angelic or a spiritual reality or a subtler reality that's very engaging, very delightful, and that furthermore that it offers a kind of blessing. That there's a kind of life support in all of this, and in a way I associate. It just occurred to me from hearing what we've been saying that it does have something to do maybe with the fact that Charlotte was in touch with that. You know, she looked at these. She looked at columns. She looked at archetypal symbols in various books and patterns and all these things she loved. She looked at leaves of real plants, and she made brushstrokes that looked like leaves and all this stuff. But whatever it was that she was connecting it to something like this level of Ritabhara Pragyan, and that may be why I have had the pleasure of finding an impact in this work that I didn't anticipate before.
Sotsu Yanagi, who was a Japanese curator and philosopher, he wrote a book called The Unknown Craftsman, and there's this chapter on pattern, which I really like, and he described pattern as not that the artist looks at nature and then imitates nature, but that the artist looks at nature and then uses that as an excuse to move the whole thing, move it to another level of wholeness, to bring it back to the self. The way I understand, the way I experience what Charlotte was doing with pattern is, and I think so many people have articulated it in beautiful ways, that it's not just putting down lines or making decorative patterns, but it was that involvement that allowed her to breathe life into and new layers, just building this each time the painting was touched or marked. And I really feel that in these paintings. I was telling David that upstairs, especially the ones that are floating here on the wall, because the paper is so alive in itself, and she's utilizing the paper. The objects become one thing. David used the word body then, and so these are hides or blankets or whatever that this pattern is infused in, and they do bring up for me some sound. Like when you're looking at these, there's some, just looking at these three right in the middle over here, there is a kind of reverberation that's coming out of those. So that kind of thing doesn't happen. And if you look at things that Jill was talking about, and the way she just lovingly build up these grounds, the ground was always important, and then there would be a dropout in the ground. The figure would. She just naturally was working with that, and it would come about in her paintings in a very easy way. And I think when she saw it, she's like, "Whoa, okay, now we're getting somewhere," and keep moving with it. it comes about through. I wanted to say it comes about through the love and continual coming back to this and bringing new level. They're just layers and layers of herself, of building and building, and that's what makes it a pattern, not the decorative sense of surface.
I think that's a great point about these pieces, and it kind of goes back to what you were talking about. At a certain point, you look at it as a flat plane. On a first approach, it's a flat surface, but I like that idea, and I think she does very well, respects that ground layer and the history of that paper and the life of that paper, and then that layering aspect she handles in such a sensitive way that the works become very spatial. And you had started to mention something about teaching in 3D or 3D for the art, and I do see many of these pieces just sort of opening up spatially as you look deeper and deeper into the plane. And I think that's one of the really beautiful things about it, is that you can kind of move back and forth, and you can kind of get lost within that space.
Well, there was a wonderful idea that we encountered in India, which is that on a certain day, workers of all kinds worship their tools and, in a way, their materials. And Charlotte thought that was kind of wonderful. Mm. So that's, you know, that there is a kind of divine force in everything in the universe, and specifically in the things that one uses to do one's own work. So she certainly loved her paper, and she definitely, I think, saw potential. Agnes Martin famously saw all of her works in her mind before she made them, or so she claimed at least. And she said she saw them the size of a postage stamp, which is an absurd contradiction because her works are often these very diffuse grids on 5x5 or sometimes even, I think, 6x6 foot canvases, and you can't even see the pencil lines in a photograph that's this big because they're so tiny. So how a postage stamp could convey. But she, you know, it was sort of that Ritambara Pragyan. She knew without seeing specifically what was potential. And I think Charlotte had something like that going on. But her work emerged. I have a lot of drawings, and these works show that she kind of had an idea, and there would be some circles or some curves or some, you know, things were sketched, and then the sketches were refined slightly, and then paint was applied and whatnot. So there were some simplistic steps through which the stages of manifestation occurred, and then there was adjustment in terms of the light or dark. One of the paintings I passed around actually has dark, I think it's that one that Jim has dark shadows, but mostly she uses light underneath forms. But these little auras are, you know, if the form is white, she'll use darkness to pop some of the elements. And the strategy is not regularly, you know, it's always intuitive and it's immediate and specific to the particular thing that's going on. I think that also Charlotte's works, many of them at least, some of them are fairly simple and it's just sort of a one-shot deal with a simple form in the center, and then that's it. But in other cases, there's layer upon layer upon layer. There's the writing, there's an abstract form, there's borders, there are other abstract, there may be a sinuous abstract form, and then there are geometric abstract forms, and then there may be floral elements. So there's a huge range of possibilities that she dances between in various ways, orchestrating according to whatever is called for. And that I think she saw each of these fields as a reflection of the laws of nature or of kind of universal organizing principles. Maybe the geometry is the more rigorous way in which things are structured efficiently, and then the more flowing sinuous lines are the processes of manifestation or birth of lively dancing. And between these, there are just different ways in which these flavors are articulated to create a specific dance in each work.
Well, this has been very nice. Thank you all for participating.
Oh,
We're so grateful.
thank you. Wow, it's beautiful.
Yes.
Really good.